Hi, everybody. I'm Emma, and I'm here with Jenna, and we're going to talk about what to do with objects when you have no idea where they came from. Yeah. And so first off, I'm Emma. I put together this webinar. Backlog is my little company. We're an archival consulting firm based in St. Louis. We also do a lot of genealogy research for clients. And so we do archival consulting, we do some platform hosting. So if you, like digital archive software like ArchiveSpace and Omeka, we set up and host those for clients. And then, like I said, we do genealogy research. And for archives, we do private collections and institutions. So like I said, I'm Emma. Backlog is my little company that I started after I was laid off during the pandemic. I found that a lot of places need a little bit of help, but can't afford or don't need a full-time person. And that's kind of what that's where we found Backlog can help out some places. The Walt Disney Hometown Museum in Marceline, Missouri is a client. They're kind of an hour from an interstate, so they wanted to bring their collection online so they can reach more people outside of their community. So that's just one example of one of the projects we've done this year. And this is Jenna.
Hi. So I'm Jenna. I am coming to you from the East Coast. So I recently started working in museum archives, but I was a lone arranger. I was a solo archivist at a university for close to 10 years. So I have done all of the things in an archival environment. I was responsible for every single part of describing and providing access to materials, managing students, all of it, writing finding aids. So I have had my fair share of archival mysteries that I've had to solve. And so I'm hoping I can impart some, not really wisdom, but some guidance through the panic of what on earth is this?
Okay. And just a little bit of housekeeping. We'll do a Q&A at the very end, so just stay muted till then, and then we can open the floor up for questions. We are recording the webinar, and tomorrow I will email it to everybody who registered, so feel free to share it, or if you missed something, you'll be able to see it tomorrow. And then any links or anything that we mentioned will be in the description of the webinar recording posted to YouTube. So you could just kind of click show more and it'll show any links that we mentioned. Okay, and from there, I'm gonna leave it to Jenna.
All right, thank you. So when I talk about objects being found in collection, I'm talking about any items that are physically residing in an archival or other repository for which there's no provenance or accession information. Just those mysterious objects where you're like, is this ours? Why is this here? Is this in the collection? Two key concepts, provenance. When I say provenance, I've also heard the word provenience, but it's not as common. Provenance is just the documented origin of the items, the materials, whether it's archives or an object. Things like purchase information, deeds of gift, transfer forms, anything that follows and documents the object or archives is chain of custody from when it was created to where it is now. In accessioning, you might also hear registration if you're in more of a museum environment, but that's the process of describing items or materials upon receipt in a repository. And it doesn't matter what format they're in, but it's any sort of information that's collected, including the provenance information, information about the context and the content. So why is this important to our collection? What is it? What's described in these papers? What are the materials used? Issues with its condition. So all of those aspects of something as it comes into your collection and how it got there. So that's all the sort of information that needs to go in an accession record. So next slide, please. So every single museum and archive has encountered found in collection or FIC objects. You got no information about a thing. It's sitting on a shelf. No one knows when it got there, why it's there, who donated it. But because it's a mystery, I also think every single museum and archives are understaffed. So no one wants to sink time into solving that mystery. So something might sit undescribed for years, which then furthers the mystery and eliminates any context or institutional memory that could have once existed, because you're getting farther and farther away from the time when the object entered the collection. But even if you can't solve the mystery completely and tie up all your loose ends and, get retroactive paperwork, you can take steps to account for the item and also keep similar mysteries from emerging in the future. Next slide, please. So why is this important? If you don't know your collection, there are some threats that creep in to your operations. You might be unable to accurately insure your collection. So if there is any sort of disaster, roof leak, whatever, you might not actually know what you've lost. And if something goes missing or is damaged, you might not be aware of that happening or when it happened. Was this object damaged when it came to us, or did it become damaged afterwards? No one really knows. No one knows when it got here. Was it 10 years ago? Was it 20 years ago? And then having things that are inaccessible because they're not accounted for and not described takes resources away from the rest of your collection and from your research community. We're in the business of preservation, but it's preservation for access generally. And if you've got stuff that no one can use because no one's described it, no one knows what it is, then you're unable to serve your community through that item or box of papers. Next slide, please. So the first thing you want to try to determine when you are dealing with found in collection objects is, do you own it? And you might not know, you might not be able to quite conclusively decide, but I just want to offer as a sort of caveat to look into your state's abandoned property law. These laws will provide guidance on how long an identified item has to be unclaimed before it can be considered legally ceded to you. You might have to publicly post information about the item and make sure that no one else, whether has a claim. Maybe this item was donated, but maybe it was actually a loan, and that the original lender has passed away, but there's a next of kin who's been wondering where that teapot is. And the situation might vary and your requirements might vary based on whether your repository is a state organization. So yeah, I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice, but just the legal advice is talk to a lawyer if you think that you need to, or if you're dealing with something potentially very valuable, or with any materials that might have other legal complications, like if you have Native American objects or remains in your collection, if you have materials that may have been looted from another country, or materials that like artwork that may have been looted during a genocide, particularly during World War II. All of those situations get a lawyer involved. Probably that doesn't apply to a ton of people, but if you're ever unsure, it's much easier to try to figure out ownership with a little bit of legal counsel on your side. Next slide, please. So when I talk about appraisal, I'm talking about research appraisal, not monetary appraisal. So when you have decided that you do own the thing, you want to try to figure out what it is. You might not know the item's origin, who donated it, why it's there, but you can research its form, its content, possibly its cultural context, find other items in other museums or archives that are similar to it. Or say if they are materials written by a particular person, maybe you can find out more about that person. And once you've done your best to identify the item, kind of what it is, like this picture is, I believe it's housing for a saint's relic. So if you realize that that's what you have to appraise its appropriateness for your collection. Is this the sort of thing that you collect? Next slide, please. Oh, wait. Okay, so I think the text has gone weird. Okay, so it's important to actually, can you go to the next slide? Okay, yeah, so these are the sort of questions that I think that during the appraisal process one should ask. So is the reason that this item or these archives were not documented because they weren't relevant? There is not a handout, but the slides, but this is being recorded, and this will be emailed to everybody, and we're going to share links at the end and in the description of the video. So that question just came up in the chat. So is the reason that the thing in your collection that is unidentified not identified because it was like dropped off by a donor, it's not relevant to your collection, and no one wanted to spend time on it? What does your collecting policy say about this type of item? You know, maybe you're a historical society, and you don't collect artwork from that's unrelated to your region, and what you found is a painting. Does this item duplicate other collection pieces that are in better condition or with better documentation? You know, if you have a collection of something from a local artisan in the 1800s, say like a silversmith, and you have a collection that's really well documented, and then you've got this one random piece of silver, well, it's kind of extraneous and probably not of much research value to your collection. And a big question that I don't think we ask enough is, do we have the capacity to take care of it? Do we have the time, the resources, the physical tools like conservation tools, or the expertise to actually take care of this item? Because if the answer is no, or if this item, after you kind of interrogated it through these questions, if the item doesn't really seem relevant to your collection, you might want to think about removing it from the collection. Next slide, please. So, but if you haven't decided to we'll get to what happens if you do want to remove it from the collection. But if you figured out that you own the thing, what the thing is, start documenting it immediately. You don't need to wait until you find out more information. You can just start an accession record and give the object or the archival box a number that's akin to your numbering system, whatever that may be. You know, a lot of times it's the 4-digit year and then a sequential number. But you know, add something to the numbering, like an F or an FIC at the end. So that will indicate that, say, the item was found in 2023, not that it was originally received in 2023. And having, however patchy it may be, having that information in an accession record will be useful, because, you know, in 2028, maybe there's a whole new staff, they find the same item, they're not sure what it is, but they find the accession record that you wrote, and they're like, okay, they found this, and it was transferred sometime before 2023. So this isn't something that came in last year. So anything at all, even if it's just the presence of the thing, needs to go into your whatever your accessioning system is, whether it's a database or a spreadsheet or just a notebook. Next slide, please. So if you in your attempting to solve the mystery and record it, describe everything you know about the item's location. Like it was in this part of the collection, you know, it was on this particular shelf. These are the things that were around it that it may or may not be related to. Here are some possible origins. And if you're able to talk to current and former staff and volunteers, they might have some institutional memory. Even if it's a vague, fuzzy memory, that might lead you to some important information. And speak to relevant local historians or experts if you can, because maybe a local historian might have done a deep dive on a particular person in your community's history, and they will be able to recognize, say, a person in a photograph or the work of a particular artisan and say, oh yeah, that's related to this, you know, this person, this time period, and that could unlock a whole bunch of new information. And, you know, you might solve the mystery, but just keep adding more information as it becomes available. And, you know, and the mystery doesn't ever have to be tied up with a bow and solved. You know, we're always learning more things about our collections, even if we did have good deeds of gift and transfer information. But interrogating the materials will provide a richer curation experience, a richer research experience, and you'll have more intellectual control over your collection. Next slide, please. So what if you know that you don't want to keep it? You know that it doesn't fit your collecting policy. You don't have the ability to take care of it. It's extraneous, or it duplicates other materials. You might want to de-accession it. But of course, you have to accession it first. Even if you know you're not going to keep it, record that item's presence at your organization, however brief it may be. That way, if someone remembers something, or if someone tries to redonate the item later, you have some information. And, this item has a long history and most of it's undocumented, but, 50 years from now, someone might say, yes, but in 2023, it was at this institution, and then it was transferred to another institution or whatever. But you do need to be careful about how you go about removing the item from the collection. The way I see it, you have 3 options for removing, whether it's a mystery item or any other item from the collection. But any of these situations can be delicate from a public relations standpoint. So as a staff, prepare how you will undertake and communicate such decisions to your community. Next slide, please. So yes, you can throw things away if it's serious. So if an item is in really bad shape and it's not particularly rare or of high research or monetary value, or most importantly, if it has a mold infestation or a pest infestation that threatens the rest of the collection, it's not worth keeping something that's unidentifiable if it's got like termites or something in it, or if it's got a really bad mold situation or moths. We've been dealing with moths at my institution and it's rough. So, throwing things haphazardly into a dumpster is not the answer. And again, you still need to record that the thing was there and it was de-accessioned. But sometimes there isn't a future for an item in a collection, especially if it was donated but doesn't have historical value. Next slide, please. So you might find that this item is not relevant to your collection, but it might be relevant to another institution. So you could transfer the item to an institution that wants it. Only do this to another nonprofit heritage organization, not an individual. Like, oh, we don't want this, but there's a collector in town who might want it. We're just going to give it to them. So you need to document this with the other institution. You need to formally correspond, keep copies of that. Again, include all of that with your accession and de-accession record. And maybe that item will fill a hole in another collection. If you do want to sell the item, if it does have monetary value and you want to sell it either to another institution or an individual, you have to be really careful. The American Alliance of Museums has specific rules about selling collections pieces. So funds raised from the sale of collections must go toward future acquisitions. Like, we sold this thing, we sold this painting because it's outside of our region, and we use that money to buy a painting by, a local artist from the Victorian period. You can't use the money from selling collections assets for operation costs or salaries, conservation treatments, or facilities. And there have been museums that have done this. They sell some paintings to keep the lights on, and they've lost their accreditation with the American Alliance of Museums. And even if you're not affiliated with that organization, it can really damage your reputation as an institution if you're kind of wheeling and dealing with your collections objects. Next slide, please. So there are ways to prevent this from happening in the future. I want to talk about documentation, revising your acquisition policies and procedures, and undertaking collections inventories. Next slide, please. So make sure that you develop with your staff really robust gift and purchase documentation procedures. Like, these are the invoices, the correspondence. We collect all these things in these and start maintaining provenance files for, basically it's your receipts. They're permanent records that explain where the thing came from. And educate all your staff, volunteers, interns, your guides on this process. So any donations in the future should be handled by collection staff to make sure that this process is followed. Your, guides or front of house employees may need to just refer potential donors to the collection staff. When I was in a university archives, sometimes people would try to drop stuff off at the circulation desk. And it's not the circulation staff's job to have the conversation about donations and have them do the deed of gift, find out more information. So I really pushed that people at the circulation desk to refer potential donors straight to me. Your accessioning procedures don't need to require complicated software, as I've mentioned. You can use a logbook, a spreadsheet, or you might have something like Archive Space or a museum platform. But don't let your lack of software hold you back. Just start documenting things. And this, this kind of goes without saying, but have deed of gift forms that all future donors need to complete. Whether, if they're not interested in a permanent donation, then perhaps a loan for an exhibit or something, but have some sort of written documentation of the item entering your care. Next slide, please. So just a note, because I think some donors really want the tax benefits, which is their right, from donating particular items, and so they need to know the monetary value. But legally, as the recipient of a gift, the archival repository or museum is not legally able to provide that monetary appraisal. That needs to be a third party, and the donor should be the person to find an appraiser to handle this. Anybody working in an archive or museum has enough to do, and I know, I'm not trained in deciding the financial value of something. I determine the research value of something. So when you're going through the acquisitions process, make sure you collect full contact information from the donor, find out their wishes about disposition. So if you decide that you're not going to keep this particular item, is there a next of kin? Do they want it given back to them? Just whatever their wishes are. At my institution, we actually just got in the mail, unannounced, a letter from the 1830s, I think, that relates to our community in some way. But we're not, and we're not the right repository for it. But there are other local organizations that have other materials related to this particular family or particular businesses. So the letter from the donor said, if you don't want it, do whatever you want with it. He doesn't want it back. So I'm in contact with those other institutions to transfer it to them. But if I didn't know, if the donor hadn't said in that letter that we could do whatever we want with it, then I would need to contact him, also, get the deed of gift paperwork, and make sure I understood what his wishes were. Next slide, please. So also, you'll need to determine if the donor wants to transfer copyright to their repository, which isn't always applicable. If they're donating books or historical objects, there might not be any sort of copyright involved. But say these are pictures that their parents took on a trip to Europe in the 1950s. Well, their parents still actually own copyright to those things. So the deed of gift should lay out, if they're donating copyright. And if not, if someone wants to use those items and reproduce them, say in a book or a documentary, then they need to go to the original donor still. If copyright is transferred to the institution, then the institution can make those decisions and give out permissions for someone to then reuse the item. Make sure that your donors understand this, as well as gifts versus loans, and that gifts are permanent. They can't then turn around and ask for it after they've given it. And if they're not comfortable with permanently parting with something, then perhaps suggest a loan. And you'll still want to collect much information from them. If it's a loan, you still want to have a record of that, maybe not an accession record, but depending on your software or your system for recording this information, you might have a loan record instead. So actually, I've already covered the what to do in disposition situations. And actually, this picture is a box of stuff that turned up at my last job. There's a bottle of branded wine a random DVD of an event that the person did not own the copyright of. So that was not a fun one. Next slide, please. So performing regular collections inventories is how you find the weird stuff and account for it, and also make sure that things aren't missing or damaged. I recently started reading a book that I'll recommend at the end that really goes over how a collections inventory should be part of your regular operations. So there are different types of collections inventories. You can do a comprehensive collection inventory where you are looking at every single thing and making sure that it has a record, just like going through all your shelves. You might be doing lot inventories if you have a lot of small similar items like silverware or pottery shards from an archaeological dig. So you might be describing things as a group, or you might just be spot checking. So you pull up a record for an item, make sure it's there, that it's in the condition that the record says it is. And for any of these inventory strategies, your collection can be open or closed. So researchers might still be able to access parts of the collection, or you might say, we are closed down, no one can come in and do research for like this week-long period while we're doing this inventory. So you have either of those options. Next slide, please. So yes, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So your collection can be open or closed. This is a picture from my last position of a bunch of stuff getting moved into the archive storage space. And I did not have, I had to inventory a bunch of stuff that was getting moved from another room, and I did not have researchers that summer. Couldn't handle it. It was really hard to figure out where everything was and needed to go. And when you're doing your inventory, make sure you're really precise about your record location information. I remember starting with an archives inventory that, I went shelf by shelf, but it didn't necessarily see how many boxes. It said the type of records that were on that shelf. Make sure that you have really precise records so that okay, there should be 6 boxes on this shelf dealing with, and these are the titles of them. Or, they might not be boxes, they could be objects, they could be textiles, whatever they are. And that will save you a lot of heartache. And it will also make sure that when someone goes to put something back, that you know where it goes, and that it will continue to be in the place where you think it is. Because as soon as something is not in the location where it's supposed to be, it's lost, essentially. I know of a particular institution, a large public institution, that recently thought that several prints from their collection had been stolen. And there was going to be a big investigation. People were freaking out. And it turned out they had been misfiled, but it was a very large collection. And so they were just a couple shelves over. But because no one had recorded the information accurately, people concluded that they had been stolen. Fortunately, they hadn't been, but you will save yourself that heartache if you make sure that your location information is accurate. So that's my soapbox on that. Where's your stuff? Next slide, please. So it's important when you're working with donors to manage their expectations. And I don't think most people who are donating materials are going to be unreasonable. They might just not know how it works. But donations should be a conversation, because maybe you're not the right repository, or maybe they have other stuff that they hadn't thought would be useful to your collection that they then decide to donate. Or they just have really good information about the context or the creation of the object or the papers or whatever that will be useful for you in your accession records. So donors also may wish to make a monetary gift to support the processing and care of the collection. Encourage this. That's awesome. Maybe you just need to buy folders, or maybe it's a huge donation and you're going to need to hire extra personnel. If that option is on the table, take it. I've never been blessed with that option before, but it's a sort of myth that like, oh, that would be awesome if that happened. But it's also okay to say no to donations that you can't handle because you don't have the staff capacity or the resources to buy all those folders. If there's inadequate expertise, if it's a very specialized item, or if it doesn't connect to your collections policy. don't make promises to donors. You don't want to say that the collection will be processed and accessible by this date. You don't want to promise that something's going to be on display or exhibited unless you are specifically accepting the item for a particular exhibit. But if you're just accepting something generally for the collection, you can't say, yes, we're going to have this on display for this much time or on this date. You shouldn't promise publication or news coverage of the gift, or offer any special privileges to the donor. Like, just because you donated something doesn't mean that you then get to look at restricted records or you get to access the collection when no one else is there. So actually, I'm a little bit lost. Emma, is there a slide after this? Or is that when we get into Q&A and stuff? Oh, yeah, the donor expectations. So, sorry, I do not have my transitions worked out. So all of these, I'm hearing music. Is anyone else?
Yeah, let me take a look at it.
Anyway, so if what I said wasn't clear, here's a slide with all the things that I just said. I think it's great to have good relationships with donors, close relationships. You're taking into care things that are important to them or were once important to them or their family. But there need to be boundaries to that relationship. So next slide, please. So accepting too much stuff or things that you can't necessarily handle is what leads to backlogs, and that's what leads to materials becoming mysteries, because if no one could address describing them when they arrived, then they are going to lose information day by day. People are going to remember less and less, and those people are going to leave, and there will just be no context. But even if you can't solve the entire mystery of what something is, any information that you can gather is still a step forward. And also any new procedures that you can develop and solidify and put into practice at your institution are also big steps forward. And there's no one right way to do this. There's this joke that, like, if you ask a question about archives, the answer is always, it depends, because there's such a variety of things in archives and museums that all require different types of decision-making, different strategies, different care. These are just some strategies to kind of push you forward if you're feeling like overwhelmed, like, what is this thing? I'm never going to figure out what it is. Hopefully this information will help guide you forward.
Yeah. So that's it for the webinar. We'll do a Q&A in just a second. Our next webinar is kind of just about the basics of finding aids. It sounds like a very casual document, but it has an archival standard. It is an archival standard, and that's on May 15th. That's another Monday at 5 p.m. If you go to our website at backlog-archivist.com/webinars, you can register for it via there and then look at all of the webinars we have coming up through August. We're doing one on how to handle students in the archives if you have the opportunity to have students work in your archives. We're doing another one on climate change in archives. And then next month, we're also doing one on military genealogy. Yeah. And then if you go to our YouTube channel, this webinar will be posted there tomorrow, but we also did a whole fall series on how to preserve different kinds of objects. So we did one on AV materials, paper, photographs, and books. So feel free to check those out. And then if you have any brick walls or anything you'd like to talk through with us, you can shoot us an email at emma@backlog-archivist.com. And again, I'll send this webinar out tomorrow. And then does anybody have any questions? And feel free to unmute yourself. But it looks like we've got a couple of...
Yeah, I'm seeing some in the chat.
Yeah.
So the first one is, what do you do with photos of unknown people, but they pertain to your collection? Depending on your institution, invite people in to maybe have a small event, whether it's an open event or you just invite certain people in the community, like local historians, and see if they can identify anybody. I know that at my previous institution, the archivist before me would take photographs of unidentified people to alumni events. So you might talk to other community organizations or people who just lived in the community a long time, and see if they recognize anybody. I think that's a good opportunity to do some outreach and bring people in, and they might be able to tell you some great stuff about your collection. Oh yes, yeah, posting mystery photos on Facebook. Also, yeah, that's also a good one, a good option if you don't want to physically have people in, and just to have the greater reach of reaching people on the internet. And also, if you are able to research any of the locations that are, if there's anything obvious, like, oh, this is some sort of event, this is a horse race, this is this particular building or this particular location in town, any of that information is also useful. And even if you don't necessarily know who the people are, maybe they're showing a particular thing that's happening that is relevant. I hope that answers your question. Next question. Previous folks in my organization had amazing programs and often bought stuff at thrift stores and garage and estate sales and use them for educational programs. I'm finding that they mix those things in with regular collections. Any advice on how to approach this problem? We're doing this at my institution. We have developed an education/props collection. So as items are determined, like we don't have enough information about them, they're maybe not in quite as good condition, and we feel okay about maybe people handling them as props or just having them on display, like in the house museum, just to kind of fill a space and to look nice. That collection is separate, and so we in the collection record say that we have de-accessioned something to the props collection. So it's no longer part of the collections department. This decision goes through our collections committee, which is actually like an external group, kind of like a board of trustees. I think depending on what the items are, you're just going to have to like research where they came from. Hopefully there are some, if not receipts, then descriptions of things being purchased. But I think it's a good idea to have stuff that isn't of the same level, at the same level of historical value, but is useful for other purposes for people to handle, or like I said, to just like fill space and look nice. But designating things as like education, collection, or props is one way to deal with that. Who in the organization should be involved in de-accessioning an object? Don't want one person making the decision. So it depends on your structure of your organization. So yeah, it shouldn't just be the person in charge, but maybe the person who oversees that part of the collection. If you have like museum objects and artwork and library materials and archives, maybe the person or people who work with those that type of material. If you have a board or a collections committee, those people. And if you have anyone, if you have a communication staff person, then that's someone who should also not involved with the decision making, but involved with the communication of the de-accessioning of the object. But like it depends on if you're volunteer run historical society, that answer will be very different from like if you're a university archives. And gosh, even if you're a university archives, that can be structured really differently. But yes, you're absolutely right. It shouldn't be one person making that decision. Much in the same way, it really shouldn't be the one person's decision to bring something into the collection. Next question. We have a collection of dolls recently donated to us to keep or sell to use funds as we see fit. Are we still stuck with using those funds to acquire collection items? Probably. I can pull up the well, it depends also if the dolls are of historical value or if they're just an asset. But we can, I'll pull up to put in the recording in the description, the American Alliance of Museums guidelines on that. I know like library book sales are another sort of like gray area because people might donate things, but they're donating the books as an asset rather than as something of historical value. But where the donor did specify that you can sell them as you see fit, that allows you to sell them, but I would recommend probably keeping that money for acquisitions. But again, I am not a lawyer and this is not legal advice. We have a traveling trunk program where we lend artifacts and materials through the library loan system. That's a cool idea. How do you form a selections committee? What are the criteria for forming a committee? So at my institution, it's formed of people who are involved in the community or in other cultural heritage institutions. So like retired curators, whose interests and expertise overlap with our mission. So you might look for, depending on the type of materials you have, perhaps either current or former professors in your area who have expertise in your time period, other like heads of other local organizations, like community organizations, nonprofits, perhaps just remember, if you're an organization that preserves collections related to a particular cultural community, then perhaps people from that community. And this also kind of depends on the governance of your organization. Do you have like a CEO? Do you have a board of trustees? Whoever needs to approve that will depend on your organization. But those are just some ideas of the types of people you might want to ask.
Yeah. And if there are no more questions, we'll end it here.
Okay.
Okay.
When our museum was founded, we were created by the city, and a city assigned liaison was assigned to the project to help develop the collection. 25 years later, we're still finding things he collected and brought to the collections with little notes that say things like, a donor said this represents a depressing time in their lives and I want it to stay anonymous. Or I found this at the dump and it was appropriate and it is applicable to the collection, but there's no paperwork. And then we have hundreds of these items. And as we go through the collections, we keep finding more of them. I'm sorry. Honestly, like I've been there. So it will be a long slog. You might be able to identify like a bunch of items, like found this at a dump. But like you might know that this actually like doesn't pertain to your collection. It's not historical. You might be able to deal with some things as lots. It kind of depends on what it all is. And if donors want to stay anonymous, that's fine. You might still, like, if you have their name in your provenance files, but you're not sharing that with researchers, like that's still a type of anonymity. I know that can be tough though. But also depends on like, what is the object that's representing a bad time in their lives? Is it artwork? What is it? If you can deal with things as lots, you can tell like all of this stuff came in together, or it's all a similar type of thing, and you can make the same decision about it, whether it's transferring it, discarding it, whatever. That might make it go a little faster, but I know that sort of thing is really time consuming. At my institution, we had a curator who kept files on the different properties that are all part of the organization, but it mixed together institutional records, historical materials, like from the original owners of the houses, and like articles about the houses, and all of that needs to be separated out. And that's one of my tasks in my new position. Yeah, I have 3 collections from similar pack rat donors nearing the end of the tunnel after years. So yes, so if more collections managers, curators thought about like, can we take care of this? Do we need it? We would have fewer of these problems. But I think sometimes the problems seem too big and we don't like want to fully look at them. But hopefully if we are able to like have some strategies to move through it, we can do that. Some comments. Reminds me of my time as a docent at IMA in Indianapolis and at Getty, and even as an auditor at the insurance company. Yeah, like there is no institution that lacks this problem. No one has ever solved it. No one will ever solve it. We can just make it less terrible.
And we're going to end here. I'll go ahead and email this out to everybody tomorrow. And thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you.